designing for the dead, how we memorialize those we love. Tonight, I'd like to look at how we do remember the dead, not just through physical monuments, but also through rituals and ceremony, although focusing on the former. Now, certainly in terms of monuments, architects, sculptors, and artists have been battling for centuries against the fleeting nature of human life by creating increasingly elaborate mortuary monuments. But this is only one of a number of ways in which we remember those that we've lost. Now, this is probably the kind of image that comes to most people's minds when they think about remembering the dead, a traditional cemetery filled with elaborate monuments. This lady is part of the Warner lot at Laurel Hill Cemetery in East Falls. Its showpiece is this enigmatic figure opening a crypt to release the soul within, and you can see the human face surrounded by angel wings, but sort of enveloped in a sea of stone ectoplasm. Sadly, she's missing her arms due to a brutal act of vandalism a number of years ago. This is the work of the Scottish-born sculptor Alexander Milne Calder. If you are a Philadelphia history buff, then I'm sure you've heard of Mr. Calder. He is best known for the statuary he created for Philadelphia City Hall, especially the 37-foot-tall statue of William Penn, which tops the monument. But long before there was a Philadelphia City Hall or a Laurel Hill Cemetery or even a William Penn, there were the Lenni Lenape, or the people. These were the Native Americans who inhabited this region when Europeans first arrived in the early 17th century. The illustration at left comes from a 1701 Swedish book on Lenape. It's a depiction of a Lenni Lenape couple seen through European eyes, while the map at right shows the extent of the Lenni Lenape and the various dialects that they spoke. Now, sadly, today we know very little about Lenape culture, including its burial practices, during what is known as the woodland period prior to contact with Europeans. Their culture, like so many native tribes, was nearly totally obliterated by European settlers during the 17th and 18th centuries, beginning with the Swedes. Most Lenape burial grounds were destroyed or covered over by colonial development. And then during the 19th and 20th centuries, many of their outlying sites were desecrated and looted in the name of archaeological exploration. The essence of Lenape burial practices seems to have been to return the body to nature as simply and unobtrusively as possible. Historians have posited that Lenape preferred to bury their dead on gently sloping hills or on mounds near rivers or creeks. During the woodland period, it's believed that the Lenape dead were buried with their heads toward the east, atop beds of charcoal and ochre. The dead were gifted with grave goods for use in the afterlife, including stone and bone tools and flints for fire making. Children were sometimes given necklaces of shell beads, sometimes with pendants shaped like birds or flowers. In the contact period, that is after Europeans arrived, the dwindling Lenape adopted many European customs. Their burial grounds began to resemble Western graveyards, with wooden stakes or posts at the heads of graves and a wooden fence demarcating the space as the province of the dead. They were no longer returned to nature, they were put aside in an area all by themselves. Contact period grave goods might include manufactured items like pewterware, glass mirrors with metal frames, scissors, gunflints, clay pipes, and glass beads. The first reported European burial in the Philadelphia region took place in September 1646, when a young girl named Katarina Hansen was buried in the churchyard of the Swedish settlement at Tinicum Island. Sadly, she was soon joined by dozens of other settlers, victims of disease, hardship, and starvation. Before long, the Tinicum settlement would be abandoned, and the surviving settlers would move northeast to Wekeko, the site of today's Queen Village. In 1677, the Wekeko settlers built a log blockhouse. This was later adapted into the church scene at left with a surrounding churchyard. And between 1698 and 1700, the blockhouse was replaced by this church, which still stands today at Columbus Boulevard and Christian Street. It's known as Gloria Dei, or Old Sweets Church. It is the oldest standing church in Philadelphia, and its burial ground is the oldest existing graveyard in Philadelphia. One of its early pastors, Andrew Rudman, lies in a place of honor under the main aisle of the church. If you were especially favored, you got as close into the church as possible. Now, by this time, Dutch and Swedish control of the region had been ceded to the English, and the entire region was now part of the English Crown Province of Pennsylvania. William Penn founded the city of Philadelphia in October 1682 as a 1,200-acre rectangle between the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers, bounded by Vine Street on the north and Cedar Street, later South Street, on the south. Before long, two communal burial grounds were established. The eastern ground near present-day Arch and 4th Streets was for residents near the Delaware, while the upper and lower burial ground were near present-day 30th Street Station for people who lived closer to the Schuylkill River. William Penn granted the eastern ground to the Quakers in 1701 for use as a Friends' burial ground, although interments had been taking place on the site as early as 1683. The Arch Street Meeting House, today home to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends, was constructed on the site between 1803 and 1811. An estimated 20,000 bodies are buried under and around the meeting house, including some of Philadelphia's most prominent early citizens, including James Logan, William Penn's secretary and the owner of Stenton, Samuel Nicholas, one of the founders of the U.S. Marine Corps, and Charles Brockden Brown, perhaps the first professional novelist in America. But only a handful of graves on the site are marked. One of them is for Dr. Robert Owen, who died around 1725 and who left no confusion about his feelings. Do not disturb. But Dr. Owen was the exception and not the rule. Most of the graves at Arch Street never had markers to begin with. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends specifically forbade grave markers until well into the 19th century, calling them marks of superfluity and excess. Now, like many traditions of the Society of Friends, this was a reaction against the ostentatious and expensive funerary rituals and monuments of 17th century England. But it also reflected the Quaker belief that the body's purpose was to contain the divine light of the soul. Once the soul had departed, the body was given a decent burial, but you avoided any rituals which might be seen as idolizing it. Those worldly Quakers who were bold enough to install gravestones often found them ripped up by the elders of their meetings. But after 1800, many meetings began to permit small, rounded marble stones bearing the name of the deceased as well as their birth and death dates. And if it were a little lighter, you could look out the window and see some of them in the adjacent Germantown Friends burial ground. But the growing presence of Anglicans and other religious groups, combined with Philadelphia's growing presence as the second largest city and wealthiest city in the British Empire, meant that funerary monuments were becoming increasingly elaborate. When Christ Church, the city's first Anglican church, completed its current structure in 1744, wealthy Philadelphians vied to have their gravestones as close to the church as possible. And again, inside the church was even better. A number of dignitaries are interred within Christ Church, including Brigadier General John Forbes, who returned to Philadelphia to die of a wasting disease after overseeing the construction of Fort Pitt, today's Pittsburgh. When Christ Church established an auxiliary burial ground at 5th and Arch Streets in 1719, it quickly filled up with the remains of Philadelphia's biggest movers and shakers, including Declaration of Independence signers Benjamin Rush, Francis Hopkinson, and, of course, Benjamin Franklin, whose grave you can see through the fence here at bottom right. But despite these A-list interments, the vocabulary of funerary architecture remained limited. If you were very wealthy or very prominent, then you might have an impressive ledger grave. This was the term for a large rectangular slab of marble that was set into or just above the ground. And this photo shows the ledger graves of Benjamin Franklin and his wife Deborah at Christ Church during the former's birthday celebration a century ago in 1926. If you wanted something a little fancier, you could always lift up your ledger and make it a pedestal grave, or fill in the sides and make it a box grave like those at the back. But unless you were a true mover and shaker, you would probably be buried under the traditional cookie-cutter-shaped gravestone, known as the Head and Shoulders or the Moon and Stars. This design was a watered-down version of the gruesome memento mori gravestones of Puritan New England with their skull and crossbones, which over time became softened into a winged cherub, and then later might become an even more abstract design. But the basic shape, one large bump framed by two smaller ones, remained the same. Your social and economic status also determined the location of your grave. Most middle-class and upper-class Philadelphians planned to spend eternity in their local churchyard. The very wealthy might be buried in a private family lot on their country estate, like the Logan lot at Stenton in Germantown. Sadly, in the 1950s, the gravestones were removed, it was paved over, and it was made into parking lots and athletic fields. Meanwhile, the poor and those on the fringes of society would be buried in one of the city's potter's fields, located on 3 of its public squares. Only the southwest square, known today as Rittenhouse Square, was not used because of its thick, clayey soil. This was where the city's brickworks were. This print shows the northwest square, nearby today Logan Circle, still in use as a potter's field in the 1820s. But around this time, everything began to change. Philadelphia emerged as a major industrial power and as an exploding metropolis. Its population doubled from 40,000 in 1800 to 80,000 in 1830. And remember that the city's boundaries were still fixed at Vine and South Street until 1854, when the city and the county became contiguous. The increase in population and development meant that the old urban churchyards were filling up quickly. Church fees for opening a burial lot soared to $30. Doesn't sound like a lot, but remember that at the time, that might be a tenth of an average worker's annual salary. Some churches moved to the suburbs. Sometimes they took their dead parishioners with them. Sometimes they left them behind for the developers to deal with. There are even newspaper accounts during this period of graveyard riots, when people would go to visit their Aunt Martha and find that she was being dug up and her bones thrown in a big pile, along with the rest of the former churchyard, to be sold to a limestone manufacturer. Chaos ensued. And even potter's fields like the Southeast Square or the Strangers' Burial Ground were being gentrified into parks, named after revolutionary figures like George Washington. Tens of thousands of people are buried in what is today Washington Square. Not just the poor, but African Americans, Catholics, Revolutionary War soldiers and prisoners, both English and American, and thousands of yellow fever victims. Few, if any, were ever removed from Washington Square. In Philadelphia, workers fought back against the lack of available burial space. They formed mutual aid associations in the 1820s and 1830s to ensure dignity for their members in death as well as life. During this time, 6 private association cemeteries were established in the working class areas north and south of the city. This photo shows Machpelah, an association cemetery on Washington Avenue, and it demonstrates the key elements that made even the most modest burial ground attractive. A nice entrance, a wall marking off the space, lots of greenery, and evenly spaced, well-kept graves. Now, during this period, changing religious and cultural attitudes also caused people to begin to view death as a kind of beautiful sleep, which required a beautiful setting. The old burial ground was being replaced by the new cemetery, which came from the Greek term for sleeping place. In 1827, James Ronaldson founded the first independent, for-profit cemetery in Philadelphia on the square bordered by 9th, 10th, Fitzwater, and Bainbridge Streets in the Moyamensing district. Although its official name was the Philadelphia Cemetery, it quickly became known as Ronaldson's. At the time, it was considered the most beautiful cemetery in the country, with neatly laid out rows of graves bordered by trees and shrubs. The success of Ronaldson's was a major factor in the early establishment of a rural cemetery in Philadelphia. Now, the rural or garden cemetery was a European innovation. Père Lachaise, founded outside Paris in 1804, is considered the first real rural cemetery. And it combined city dwellers' fear of infectious disease with romantics' love of picturesque landscapes to create a carefully designed Arcadian vista of natural beauty punctuated by magnificent man-made monuments. Père Lachaise was the first architect-designed cemetery. Its designer was Alexandre Théodore Brongniart, who would go on to design the Paris Bourse. The birth of the rural cemetery also paralleled the growth of the picturesque school of landscape architecture, especially as practiced in England by Humphrey Repton and John Claudius Loudon. Thanks in large part to Loudon's designs and writings, the growth of the rural cemetery presaged the growth of public parks and arboreta, especially in America. In 1831, the first American rural cemetery was established, Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1835, John J. Smith, a Quaker entrepreneur, editor, and librarian, not to mention a resident of Germantown, he lived at Ivy Lodge on East Penn Street, lost a 5-year-old daughter. At her funeral, Smith watched in dismay as her tiny coffin was lowered with a splash into a water-filled grave at the Friends Western Burial Ground at 16th and Cherry Streets. Later, he went back to visit her unmarked grave and found that he was having trouble remembering exactly where she was buried. Smith wished for a more aesthetic, comforting way to remember his child than the austere Friends Burial Ground. He gathered a group of civic leaders and investors and purchased a country estate on the Schuylkill River, nearly 4 miles north of the city. In 1836, the Laurel Hill Cemetery Company was incorporated. At 36 acres, Laurel Hill was almost 3 times the size of Ronaldson's, and its location far outside the city was meant to ensure its bucolic isolation forever. If you've been there, you know it didn't quite work out as planned. A Scottish immigrant named John Notman was hired to lay out its grounds and also to design an imposing gatehouse in the neoclassical style with arched portals, fluted columns, and a flaming memorial urn on top. This became the calling card for Laurel Hill, which at the time was sort of a risky financial endeavor for its founders. The massive white structure dominated the then rural landscape around the village of Falls of Schuylkill. Besides the gatehouse and the layout, Notman also designed a Gothic chapel where funerals could be held and a Tudor enclosure for a sculptural group based on Walter Scott's story, Old Mortality. This was the first thing you saw when you came in the cemetery. Before long, Notman was in demand to design individual graves, such as this one for the Brown family. Other leading architects competed for the chance to design for cemeteries. The little Greek temple it left was designed by William Strickland, who created the Merchants Exchange and the Second Bank of the United States. This early picture also gives you some idea of how incredibly verdant Laurel Hill was in its original state. John J. Smith, a talented horticulturist, planted several thousand trees and shrubs on the already lush site. Well, after a shaky start, Laurel Hill became not only the place to be buried in Philadelphia, but also the place to be seen above ground, attracting tens of thousands of visitors every year. Long before the establishment of Fairmount Park and the Museum of Art, Laurel Hill fulfilled both roles. It transformed Philadelphians' ideas about how to memorialize the dead. Its wooded chambers were designed to serve as backdrops for spectacular monuments. Its managers exhorted its lot holders to create artistic masterpieces to grace their corner of the cemetery, and they could afford to do so. Laurel Hill's spacious lots provided plenty of room for several generations, as well as for a large-scale central monument. From the very beginning, Laurel Hill targeted Philadelphia's elite. A 100-square-foot lot cost $75, and again, that was about a third of a worker's average annual salary. Dynasty lots satisfied wealthy Philadelphians' dreams about preserving the family heritage for eternity. Architects, sculptors, and stone carvers realized that Laurel Hill was the perfect outdoor showroom as well as a laboratory for new styles. Their work might be seen by both lot holders and the elegant strollers who packed the cemetery. With luck, an architect might receive a commission not just to design a family's monument, but also their Rittenhouse Sq townhouse or their Germantown villa. A new language of mourning evolved, drawing heavily on popular classical motifs: the Greco-Roman funerary urn, the weeping Niobe, and the Egyptian sun symbol, the obelisk. As a matter of fact, so many obelisks went up in Philadelphia and Laurel Hill in its early days that the managers were writing their lot holders saying, for God's sake, please choose something other than an obelisk. Well, they were helped in this when construction on the Washington Monument ground to a halt in the 1850s, the victim of financial impropriety and political infighting. Suddenly, obelisks became a lot less popular. Besides these standard symbols, designs began to evolve that told you the story of the individual buried there. Gravestones became pop-up obituaries. A broken column might denote the grave of a man who died in his prime, often in battle, and an officer saber draped over the monument told you that this was the grave of a war hero. Rural cemeteries like Laurel Hill were also important psychological aids to help 19th century Philadelphians deal with the inescapable presence of death. In 1850, the life expectancy for white males and females was around 40. Half of what it is today. And child mortality remained extremely high throughout the century. It's been estimated that at least 5 out of 10 children could be expected to die before their 10th birthday. This is the Barton lot in South Laurel Hill. The Bartons had 13 children. 10 of them died before their 10th birthday. They're all lined up in a row here. In some cases, they doubled up on the tombstones. 2 boys who were buried under larger stones died in their teens. 1 son out of their 13 children lived to maturity. Well, in 1837, less than a year after Laurel Hill opened, a doctor named John Elkington established a second rural cemetery on bucolic North Broad Street in what was then North Penn Township. Elkington originally named his cemetery Père Lachaise, after the one in Paris, but it was a very patriotic age, and he received so much criticism for the foreign-sounding name that he had to change it to Monument Cemetery, after a proposed central monument to George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. The gatehouse, built in 1840, was in the latest Gothic style. It was designed by John Sartain, the leading engraver of the period. The central monument, a simple obelisk, was not erected until 1869, just about 30 years after the cemetery's founding. The cemetery had a lot of financial ups and downs. There was a lot of talk about what Dr. Elkington was really doing with all those burial fees. In 1840, a third rural cemetery opened, the Woodlands in West Philadelphia. And within a few years, the Woodlands would rival Laurel Hill as the preferred burial place for the city's elite. Originally, the Woodlands was the estate of botanist William Hamilton. The 350-acre preserve was a horticultural wonderland, while the Federal-era mansion was one of Philadelphia's architectural gems. So the Woodlands was an ideal site for a rural cemetery. In 1858, John MacArthur, later the architect of Philadelphia City Hall, designed this massive Doric entrance to the Woodlands at the cemetery's northwest corner. It was obviously meant to emulate and outshine Laurel Hills. First of all, the central arch is a lot taller and a lot bigger, and it's made of real stone, as opposed to Laurel Hill, where you had wood that was painted to look like marble. In an example of the symbiosis between rural cemeteries and public parks, Eli Kirk Price, one of the Woodlands founders, also helped to create the Fairmount Park Commission in 1867, serving as its chairman until 1884. Mount Moriah, founded near Cobb's Creek in 1855, was the first rural cemetery to target the working class audience. This Romanesque, Gothic, Tudor, kitchen sink fantasy of a gatehouse, designed by Stephen Decatur Button, illustrates the hunger of working Philadelphians for the same stately resting places enjoyed by the wealthy. And Mount Moriah made sure they could afford it. The same 100 square foot lot that might cost $75 at Laurel Hill only cost $25 at Mount Moriah. In East Falls, Mount Vernon Cemetery was established in 1856 at Ridge and Lehigh, right across from Laurel Hill Cemetery. John Notman, who had designed Laurel Hill's neoclassical gatehouse a generation before, created this Italianate entrance, complete with a campanile. Now, reflecting the racial and social prejudices of the day, many of the first rural cemeteries were restricted to white Protestants. In response, other racial and religious groups founded their own cemeteries. This is the chapel and gatehouse to Lebanon Cemetery at 18th Street and Passyunk Avenue. It was one of Philadelphia's two African-American rural cemeteries, both founded in 1849. Philadelphia's Catholics established Cathedral Cemetery at 48th and Lancaster Avenue in West Philadelphia in 1849 as well. This was the first of the 12 diocesan cemeteries that now dot our region. And one of the reasons that they established the Cathedral Cemetery was to raise funds from the sale of burial lots to continue and complete the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul on Logan Square. By this time, rural cemeteries were becoming known as a real cash cow. Congregation Mikveh Israel's original burial ground, the first for Jews in Philadelphia, was founded at Spruce and 8th in 1740, but by the early 19th century, it was overcrowded. In 1841, Mikveh Israel purchased a second burial ground on Federal Street between 11th and 12th. Napoleon LeBrun, who designed the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, as well as the Academy of Music, designed their gatehouse and Medahar, the house for the ritual preparation of the dead. His design was in the Egyptian revival style. This was seen as being appropriate for cemeteries, but it was also held as fitting for Jewish institutions, evoking associations with the captivity and Exodus. In 1853, Mount Sinai opened as the first non-congregational Jewish cemetery in Philadelphia. That is, you didn't have to belong to a specific congregation to be buried there. Located in Frankfort, Mount Sinai boasted its own impressive gatehouse. Sadly, this has been torn down. Luckily, the mortuary chapel still stands. This was designed by Frank Furness and still stands at the cemetery. He designed it for Mount Sinai in 1890. The 1870s was the golden age of the rural cemetery, as America dealt with the mass death and massive grief caused by the Civil War. By this time, there were more than 20 rural cemeteries spread out across the region. On May 30th, 1868, the first official Decoration Day was held. Americans flocked to cemeteries to clean and decorate the graves of the recently fallen, as these veterans and orphans are doing at Philadelphia's Glenwood Cemetery. Soldiers' graves were marked with flags, a tradition that continues today, although the name of the holiday has been changed to Memorial Day. But this period was also the dawning of the Gilded Age, and Philadelphia's new money demanded bigger and better monuments. Like the pyramids, a big tomb was a way of announcing that you had arrived, even if you had departed. This is the grave of Thomas Evans at the Woodland Cemetery. Thomas Evans was not a Civil War general, not a war hero. He was a dentist, a very wealthy dentist. He practiced in Paris during the Second Empire. He was a favorite of Napoleon II and the Empress Eugenie. And when the Second Empire fell, he actually spirited Eugenie away to safety in England. So he wanted people to remember him. So he had the money to pay for this and found the dental school at the University of Pennsylvania. Pretty impressive. And as you can see from this, the obelisk has come roaring back into style. They started to work again on the Washington Monument in 1876 and completed it in 1888. Central Laurel Hill, the Gilded Age section of the cemetery, resembles an obelisk jungle. Also in central Laurel Hill are the mausoleums, which enjoyed a renaissance on a bigger and better scale after the Civil War. The southern edge of Laurel Hill's central section, where Hunting Park Avenue meets the Schuylkill River, became known as Millionaire's Row. This was the final resting place of some of Philadelphia's biggest industrialists and financiers, mostly self-made men. Just like they built their huge mansions on North Broad Street rather than around Rittenhouse Sq, where the old money lived, and building their huge country estates on the Old York Road instead of in Chestnut Hill or Germantown, they built their big honking mausoleums on Millionaire's Row instead of North Laurel Hill, where the old Philadelphians clustered. This is the mausoleum of Henry P. Diston, who went from being a poor orphan to owning the largest saw manufactory in the world. It's designed by John MacArthur, who designed City Hall, as I mentioned, and also designed several houses for the Diston family. By the way, MacArthur and his family are also buried at Laurel Hill, and I think this is the living illustration of the maxim, the cobbler's children always go barefoot. As Philadelphia grew more congested, so did older cemeteries like Laurel Hill. As the neighborhoods around these cemeteries deteriorated, suburban flight became a reality for both the living and the dead. Across the Schuylkill River in Ballackinwood, West Laurel Hill Cemetery was opened in 1869 by Laurel Hill founder John J. Smith. West Laurel Hill was an example of the newly fashionable landscape lawn cemetery, which tried to create a more natural, park-like atmosphere by simplifying layouts and plantings. Smith selected the firm of Cope and Stewardson to design the bell tower that became one of the cemetery's landmarks. Now, Cope and Stewardson was the preferred architectural firm for Philadelphia's gentry, especially its Quaker gentry, churning out country houses in Chestnut Hill and collegiate Gothic buildings for Princeton and Penn. But around the sedate bell tower rose a forest of gloriously over-the-top mausoleums, most of them built by Philadelphia's wealthy brewing families. The winner for sheer funerary exuberance has to be the mausoleum for brewer John Betts. And if you think it looks grand on the outside, you should see the inside. There's also the Berwind Mausoleum, more restrained and neoclassical in design, the final resting place of coal mining magnate Charles Berwind and his family. Architect Horace Trumbauer based his design on the ancient Tower of the Winds in Athens. And then you have the Drake Mausoleum, the resting place of the Drake and Cardeza families. You'll notice the sphinxes on the corners. Charlotte Drake Cardeza was a world traveler, and she wanted this represented in her mausoleum. This was originally in Laurel Hill, but in the 1930s, Charlotte felt that Laurel Hill was just getting too crowded and down at heels, so she had the entire mausoleum, along with the 6 or 7 people buried there, simply transported across the Schuylkill to a nice open plot in West Laurel Hill. By the way, she was another Germantown resident. She lived for many years at Montebello on East Washington Lane. But these huge mausoleums were a last hurrah as attitudes toward death began to change again and a new era of simplicity came in. Whereas the elegant monuments of the 19th century sought to beautify death, these simpler graves of the early 20th century, like this one for Owen Wister at Laurel Hill, seemed to negate its presence. In 1909, Philadelphia architect Clarence Zanzinger created the Bach-Curtis pergola at Laurel Hill. It marks the resting place of the family of Edward Bach, editor and publisher of the Ladies' Home Journal, and his wife Mary Louise Curtis Bach, founder of the Curtis Institute of Music. Now, one of Bach's goals was to transform domestic architecture and discard Victorian stuffiness for a new simplicity. He's credited with inventing the term living room to replace parlor, which had gained sort of morbid associations. That's where you laid out the body, hence the term funeral parlor. So let's call it a living room instead. And he was always urging his readers to get out and smell the roses, especially by putting up a trellis or a pergola in their backyards where they could sit with their families in the evening. So it seemed appropriate that he would have a pergola constructed for his own family where they could rest for eternity. Now, ironically, neither he nor his wife Mary are actually buried there. They're both elsewhere, but members of their family are here. The Bach pergola revolutionized funerary design and received national attention. The public ledger gushed that all gives the idea of peace and beauty and restfulness. The cemetery no longer is a gruesome spot. Well, by the early 20th century, many older cemeteries were afraid of being viewed as gruesome spots, and they were trying to play down their Victorian heritage. In 1936, the MacArthur Gatehouse to the Woodlands was demolished and replaced by this much simpler structure designed by Paul-Philippe Cret, head of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Cret was no stranger to cemetery design. After World War I, he worked with the American Battle Monuments Commission to design several European cemeteries where American soldiers are buried. In 1930, Cret designed the White Marsh Memorial Park in Horsham. Inspired by Forest Lawn Memorial Park near Los Angeles, White Marsh was one of the first memorial parks on the East Coast and part of a new wave in cemetery design. Let's not just have small monuments, let's get rid of monuments altogether. Individual monuments are limited to discrete bronze plaques flush with the ground. The only structures allowed, at least at first, were central buildings and sectional markers. The centerpiece of White Marsh is the Tower of Chimes, a huge mausoleum featuring guardian lions by the French sculptor Jean de Marco. Well, while these new memorial parks were springing up in the suburbs, older city cemeteries were succumbing to decay and destruction. The Gothic Gatehouse at Monument Cemetery was demolished in 1903 to permit the construction of Burke Street through the cemetery. In 1956, Temple University obtained Monument Cemetery to use its land for parking lots and playing fields. About 28,000 bodies were removed to Longview Cemetery in Rockledge. The monuments, including the central obelisk, were dismantled. Most were sold to developers who used them as riprap for the new Betsy Ross Bridge on the Delaware River or for flood control at the nearby Frankfort Creek. And many of the monuments dumped in these waterways over 70 years ago are still clearly visible today, even at high tide. The only remnant of Philadelphia's Second Rural Cemetery is part of its original stone wall, now the entrance to Temple Parking Lot Number 1. Last year, they did some renovations in the parking lot, and guess what? They kept turning up coffins. They always seemed to miss a few. So other cemeteries that survived were often left to rot by negligent owners. John Notman's gatehouse to Mount Vernon, minus its original campanile, is now, for many years, looked over a closed, derelict cemetery. Mount Moriah, Stephen Decatur's historic gatehouse, was also allowed to deteriorate over the years. Today, only the front facade and the wings remain. And we were talking about this earlier. In 2011, the acting owners of Mount Moriah vanished, forcing the cemetery to cease operation. Luckily, 2 organizations have stepped in to try to preserve the historic site. But as you can imagine, it's a Herculean task. This is the largest cemetery in Philadelphia at 227 acres. Part of it is in Delaware County. And much of the property was either not maintained for decades, and many of the graves were vandalized or left to crumble. Yet some progress is being made thanks to these volunteers' determined efforts. Recently, the facade of the historic gatehouse was stabilized. A similar episode is hopefully underway at long-neglected Mount Vernon. A group of determined volunteers managed to wrest control from an absentee landlord and began to clean up the cemeteries and reopen it to the public. Now, in 2025, the cemetery was taken over by a new owner, Steelsman Town Cemetery Company. I gather that there have been some disputes between the volunteers and the new owners. Hopefully, they can be resolved. Meanwhile, a variety of new designs of new trends have emerged in cemetery design. For the past 30 years, laser engraving, usually on polished black granite to provide maximum contrast, has allowed us to personalize grave markers to an unprecedented degree. At Eden Cemetery, the historic African American cemetery in Collingdale, is the grave of Charles Albert Tindley, civil rights leader and pastor of the Tindley Temple on South Broad Street. Besides his portrait and biography, the marker provides the words and music to one of his hymns, Beams of Heaven, As I Go. Befitting our new Gilded Age, America is witnessing a revival of mausoleums in a variety of unusual, striking, and grandiose styles. The thoroughly modern mausoleum might offer such cutting-edge amenities as air conditioning, statues of the dearly departed, and theaters showing professionally produced films about the dearly departed. Do they sell popcorn? I don't know. At the other end of the spectrum, more and more Americans are choosing simpler, less permanent forms of interment. Cremations now account for over 1/2 of all burials in America. The first crematory in America was established outside Pittsburgh in 1876. The first one in our region was the Chelton Hill Cemetery Crematorium in Germantown, established in 1888. Columbaria, burial sites or structures for the cremains or cremated remains of its inhabitants, are now a prominent feature of almost every cemetery and churchyard. In 2018, Laurel Hill opened a columbarium, a community mausoleum, and a scattering garden. And options like these allow historic burial grounds with limited land to continue to operate as active cemeteries. At this time, more Americans are beginning to consider green burials, only about 5% at present, but it seems to be growing quickly. In 2008, West Laurel Hill Cemetery established Nature's Sanctuary, a natural burial section landscaped with indigenous plants that resembles a wildlife reserve more than a cemetery. And in so many ways, this new approach seems to represent a full circle back to the Lenni Lenape. It's as if we are trying to mimic their efforts to return the dead to nature as simply and unobtrusively as possible. Well, speaking of the Lenni Lenape, since 1900, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, has provided for the protection and return of Native American human remains and funerary or sacred objects that may reside in either public or private collections, either to lineal descendants or to the tribes most closely associated with them. As I mentioned earlier, many of these remains and artifacts have been taken from Native American burial sites during the 19th and 20th century. And until recently, many had been on display at museums for years, including locally the University of Pennsylvania, Temple, the Academy of Natural Sciences, and the Mutter Museum, among others. In 2022, the remains of about 200 Lenape ancestors and associated funerary objects that had been held by institutions around the country were committed to final rest on their homelands near Philadelphia, after having been returned to the 5 recognized Lenni Lenape tribes. Pennsbury Manor in Bucks County, the reconstruction of William Penn's country estate, was chosen as the site for the reinterment. NAGPRA has also spurred a renewed effort to protect and preserve the few remaining Native American burial grounds and to transfer their custodianship to culturally affiliated tribes. In 2022, with NAGPRA assistance, a Chester County woman named Carol McCloskey deeded a half-acre parcel to the Delaware Nation in Anadarko, Oklahoma. This land contains the only officially recognized Native American burial ground in Chester County, known as Indian Knoll. The site is now protected from further development and desecration, hopefully for eternity. According to NAGPRA, the idea behind all of these efforts is that human remains of any ancestry, quote, must at all times be treated with dignity and respect, a wish that I think most of us have for ourselves and for those we love. Thank you very much.